Welcome, everyone. Sorry about my mistake in terms of technology, but I want to first of all thank you, Sarah, for your introduction. And also I want to welcome everyone to the Zoom presentation tonight. My name is Kevin Mitchell, and the title of my presentation tonight is The Negro National League, A Journey Through the Stormy Seas of Professional Baseball. I want to thank the Public Library of Wichita for including this presentation in their baseball series this summer. And of course, thank everyone for taking the time to Zoom in tonight. First of all, I am not the Kevin Mitchell that played with the New York Mets in 1986 and won the World Series, nor who also won the Most Valuable Player Award in 1989 in the National League when he played for the San Francisco Giants. When I worked in sales and marketing in the 80s and in the 90s, I would always know which customers were baseball fans, because when I introduced myself, they'd have a big smile on their face and start laughing. It didn't give me any extra sales, but I did enjoy talking baseball with them. As Sarah said, I am a blogger. And one thing that I want to mention is that I also Twitter each day in terms of baseball history. And my Twitter handle is Kevin L. Mitchell at Last Train to Coop. I'm a baby boomer and grew up, fell in love with baseball in the late 1950s, which was called the golden era of baseball, and at a time when baseball was definitely the national pastime. And I grew up learning about guys like Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle, Ernie Banks, Frank Robinson, and Henry Aaron. As a matter of fact, I remember the first World Series that I remember was in 1957, when the Milwaukee Braves defeated the New York Yankees. And at that time, Milwaukee had a AAA team, minor league team in Wichita called the Wichita Braves. I did play baseball when I was younger. This is a picture of the team I played for when I was in the sixth grade, and we won the championship that year. And this is me and the team that I played for in the eighth grade. We weren't as good. We just barely finished 500. Right now, I just love to read and write about baseball history. And the topic that we're going to talk about tonight is definitely a part of that history. And that's the Negro National League, a journey through the stormy seas of professional baseball. Last year, 2020 was the centennial anniversary of Negro League baseball. It was the beginning of the Negro League baseball era, which was designated to start in 1920. Also, at the end of last year, the Negro Leagues were designated as professional baseball leagues. Now, this was something that was a fact based on oral history and research, but it was finally authorized that it was a professional baseball league. And the stats of the Negro League players from the 1920s forward are now part of Major League Baseball statistical records. And during this centennial year, $1 million was donated by the Players Association and Negro League Baseball to the Negro League Baseball Museum. And that there were other activities that were going to be planned, but due to COVID-19, the season was shortened. But why was 1920 designated the start of the Negro League baseball era? The reason for that was the Negro National League was founded and formed in 1920. And it's the first successful baseball league. And existed for 11 years, from 1920 to 1931. 18 members of the Baseball Hall of Fame either played or managed in the Negro National League. And it was the foundation for Black professional baseball. The blueprint was used to form two other leagues that kept Negro League baseball operating until the 1960s. There was the Negro National League that was formed in 1933 and existed until 1948, and the Negro American League that was formed in 1937 and existed until 1962. The truth is, of course, is the Negro National League was a product of racial discrimination, but it is still a story that needs to be remembered because it's a part of baseball history. It's a part of African-American history, and it's woven into the fabric of 20th century American history. We're not going to have time tonight to cover everything in regards to the Negro National League, but hopefully you'll get a sense of its place in history, in the history of this game of baseball, which I think we all love. Now, African Americans played baseball prior to 1920. There's proof that during the antebellum South, that the slaves played some type of bat and ball game on Saturday and Sunday evenings as a type of entertainment and an engagement that was despite the hardships of slavery. And there were also Black freedmen playing baseball in New York in the 1840s and 1850s. And then after the Civil War, more amateur Black teams were formed. The Philadelphia Pythians were formed in the late 1860s, and they are one of the better Black amateur teams during that time. And they tried to join a National Baseball Association in Philadelphia at that time, but they were declined because of the color of their skin. And baseball was converted to a professional game, a professional sport about this time. The National League was formed in 1876. However, African Americans played professional baseball at this time, despite the racial discrimination. The color line was drawn, but it was not quite solid. Bud Fowler is considered the first African American to play professional baseball. He played in the minor leagues 1878 to 1889. Then William Edward White was an ex-slave, but he played one game for the Providence Grays in 1879. And at that time, the Grays were a part of the National League. So technically, he is the first African-American to play professional baseball. But since he only played one game, that title goes to Moses Fleetwood Walker, who in 1884 played with the team in Toledo, which was a part of the American Association, which at that time was a major league team, a major league. So he's getting the recognition as the first African-American to play Major League Baseball. Now, Walker and a handful of others played in the AAA baseball in the International League in 1887. However, by 1890, there were no African Americans or dark-skinned Latino players in professional baseball. And that was a reflection of the racial mood in the country at that time. But the color line had been drawn. But African Americans still played professional baseball. The Cuban Giants is considered one of the first African-American professional baseball teams. They were formed in 1885, and they were basically the wait staff of the Argyle Hotel and Resort on Long Island, New York. And they were formed to play games for entertainment for the hotel patrons. The Page Fence Giants were also formed about this time, and also the Cuban Giants. And from 1900 to 1919, there were other African-American teams formed. One was the Philadelphia Giants, and another were the the Chicago Leland Giants. And during that time, there were attempts made for a Negro League to be formed, but all of the attempts failed, and none of them made it through one season. Now, the beginning of the decade in 1920, the World War I had ended in 1918, and the country was transitioning back into a peacetime economy, and the country was trying to return to normalcy. Now, there were two changes in the Constitution about this time. There was the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote, and that was passed in 1920. And the other, at the beginning of the decade, was the 18th Amendment, which began prohibition, and that banned the manufacture and sales of liquor. And this basically was the decade that gave birth to bootleggers and gangsters, such as Al Capone. It was the Roaring '20s, and this was the backdrop for the Negro National League. It was a period of rapid growth and rapid industrial and economic growth. The national wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929. However, it was not for everyone, because African Americans in the South were still sharecroppers. It was a time of exuberant and freewheeling popular culture. There were new non-traditional clothes styles, especially for women. There were new dances like the Charleston. It was the beginning of the jazz age, and there were rejections of many traditional morals. There was changes in terms of sexual morals. And this is just a picture of the changes in styles for women during that time. This was the time where Bessie Smith's career began as the jazz singer, and also at the time where Louis Armstrong and his jazz band began. In terms of race relations, the African Americans did serve in the military during World War I. The military was segregated, of course, but there were 50,000 African Americans that served in the military, which is about 1/3 of the US Armed Forces during the war. But they returned home to racial discrimination. And believe it or not, 20 African American soldiers were lynched during this time while in their uniform. During the war, there was a migration of African Americans from about 300,000 African Americans migrated from the South to the East and the Northeast and Midwest. They were escaping harsh racial discrimination from the South, and there were also better economic opportunities in the North. And cities like Detroit, where the auto industry was just beginning to boom, and places like Chicago and Kansas City, where there were opportunities in meatpacking companies, and also in terms of railroad, and in places like Pittsburgh, where there was steel production. These were all opportunities that African Americans migrated north to attain. But in the 1919, there were about 50 lynchings of African Americans. Between June and December of 1919, there were 25 race riots. There was one in Chicago, on which there were 38 people killed and 587 injured in 3 days. Then, of course, in 1921, there was the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa that has been memorialized this year. And estimated about 300 African Americans were killed. So nationwide, there was racial tension as went into the new decade of the 1920s. And of course, in Major League Baseball, the status of racial relations was reflected, as there were no African Americans nor dark-skinned Latino players that played in Major League Baseball since the late 1880s. The main issue for Major League Baseball at the start of the decade, of course, was what happened in the 1919 World Series. The Chicago White Sox and the Cincinnati Reds, where the White Sox were favored, but the gamblers got to some of the White Sox players and to throw the series, and the White Sox lost, even though they were favored. There were 8 players who were indicted. Not all of them were paid to throw the series, but the ones who weren't paid, they knew about what was going to happen, but they didn't tell. And so there were 8 were acquitted during the trial. However, in 1920, Kennesaw Mountain Landis was named as the Major League Commissioner. He was the first Major League Commissioner, Major League Baseball Commissioner, and his task was to repair the damage done by the Black Sox scandal. And he suspended all 8 players permanently from Major League Baseball. And that included shoeless Joe Jackson, who at that time was the most talented player in Major League Baseball. And to this day, Jackson is not in the Hall of Fame because of his involvement in the black scandal. But Landis also helped Major League owners perpetuate the invisible color line. And fair or not, he was the face of racism in Major League Baseball all the way until he died in 1944. And he always claimed that there was no color line that existed, which was not true, as African, and he implied basically that African American and dark-skinned Latino players were just not good enough to play in Major League Baseball. And that was also not true. And a lot of the Major League players knew that because they played against African American and Latino players in the offseason in exhibition games. But the start of 1920, the decade was also the decade of Babe Ruth and the New York Yankees. The dead ball era came to an end in 1920. Prior to 1920, in 13 years in the major leagues, the number one home run hitter hit less than 10 home runs. The average number of runs scored per game during this time was 3 to 5. But in 1920, there were changes. Before then, the pitchers could doctor up baseballs. If there was a foul ball, it was thrown back into play, and the pitchers used worn baseballs to in terms of how they use their fingers and their fingernails. All right, and it made the ball do a lot of crazy things. It was more movement on the balls, and the fastballs were not straight. However, there were changes in the rules where now more balls were being produced, and foul balls in the stands were not thrown back into the game. So the pitchers could not use the worn baseballs to their advantage. And also spitballs and other balls that were substances were put on were banned. And even the balls were wound by machines Okay, so they were more tightly wound than when they were wound by the hands, and that made them go further when they were hit. So in 1920, Babe Ruth hit 54 home runs, and that was more. He had more home runs than some teams did that year. And during the decade, the Yankees won 6 American League pennants, and they won 3 World Series. Now, in terms of Black professional baseball, as the decade started, there were no formal pro Black professional leagues. They played games against white semi-pro teams, industrial league teams. They played winter ball in the Caribbean and also out in California, and they played fall exhibition games with major league teams. And Black teams won some of these games. And that's why I said that the major league players knew that there were Black players that were good enough to play in the major leagues. There was also a Black touring circuit where Black teams traveled by train from city to city to play the local teams at their city. And I'm sure Wichita was on the Black touring circuit for Negro League baseball at that time. Now, the problem that Black teams had during that time were they were undercapitalized. The owners did not have the financial capital compared to major league teams. They did not have another successful business that they could use funds to invest in the baseball team. That's why there were cash flow problems with Black teams at this time. Also, Black teams did not own their own stadium, so they had to lease the stadiums from major league teams and also other minor league teams in order to play the game. And those rental fees were anywhere from 20 to 30% of the gate receipts. So that made the operating capital or the operating cost for Negro League teams much higher. In terms of the market, the Black fans, they were on the low end of the economic scale, and their income was affected by the volatile swings of the economy. So a lot of times they did not have the money for extra money for sporting entertainment. And so the main revenue for Negro League teams were from gate receipts. So in order to maximize revenues, the more games they played, the more money that they made. Then in terms of the players, the year by year movement, the contracts, they were not standard contracts. A lot of them were verbal contracts. So the contracts did not have the reserve clause that the major league teams had. So players moved from team to team, from year to year. They went where they could made the most money. And the way teams were built up during this time where they tried to get the best players that they possibly could by robbing other teams. And the whole mentality of Negro League baseball was independent, was an independent survivor mentality. And this was a mentality that was a problem throughout the Negro League baseball era. And what we're going to find is it was caused operating problems for the Negro National League. But the story of the Negro National League is the story of Andrew Foster. He was a former pitcher, one of the best pitchers in Negro League baseball in the early 1900s. And he was the owner of the Chicago American Giants. He got his nickname Rube, because when he was a pitcher in an exhibition game, he defeated Rube Waddell, who was one of the best major league pitchers during the early 1900s and who was in the Hall of Fame. So that's how Foster got his nickname. And he saw the need for a league for for the Negro Leagues from an owner's perspective. He saw the need for a league. He felt that there needed to be more cooperation between Negro League owners, and the bidding for players needed to be stopped. He also thought there needed to be a more competitive balance that would attract more fans and generate more revenue. He felt that a more formal organization was needed to put Negro League baseball on a sound financial footing, that there needed to be strong leadership that needed to settle disputes, and also to invoke policies that would benefit all the teams. And he also felt that a league was needed to deal with the racial barriers that the Black teams faced. And he felt that they should focus on things that they had control of, and that was the internal operation of the teams. He understood the racial tension that existed during the time, and he saw the league as his motto was, "We are a ship, and all else is the sea." That the league was the ship traveling through the sea that was troubled by the winds of racial discrimination. And he's considered the father of Black baseball, and he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1981. So on February 13th and 14th in 1920, he called a meeting of the Black team owners in the Midwest. And the meeting was held at the YMCA building in Kansas City, Missouri, which was down the street from what is now the location of the Negro League Museum here in Kansas City. He had incorporated the Negro National League in 6 states, and he invited representatives from Black newspapers in Chicago and Indianapolis. So the Black media was in the beginning with the Negro National League. However, throughout the 11 years, they had a love-hate sort of relationship where the newspapers supported the Negro National Leagues, but there were conflicts and criticism because there were different views on the goals. Now Foster got no response from his invitations to African-American teams along on the Eastern Seaboard. So what resolved was an 8-team league from the Midwest. There were the Chicago American Giants, the Kansas City Monarchs, the Indianapolis ABCs, the Detroit Stars, the Chicago Giants, the St. Louis Giants, the Dayton Marcos, and the Cuban West Stars, who were out of Cincinnati. Each team paid $500 for joining the league, and Foster was named president and he was named president and secretary. On the Chicago American Giants was Cristobal Torrente. He's considered one of the best outfielders in Negro League baseball. He was from Cuba, and he was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 2006. The Monarchs were owned by James L. Wilkinson. He had been involved in the Negro Leagues since the early 1900s. His first team was called All Nations, and this was really the first multicultural team in professional baseball. His players loved him because he treated them fairly. And Foster initially did not want him to be a part of the league because he was white, but Wilkinson had a lease on the stadium here in Kansas City. that Foster really needed for the team here. So he wound up being a very close ally to Foster, and he was the longtime vice president of the league, and he was also an innovator, as we'll find out later. He was one of the main innovators of night baseball, and he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2006. On the Monarchs at that time was Wilbur Bullet Rogan. He was the Monarchs' best hitter and also the best pitcher. And he's considered one of the best all-around players in baseball history. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1998. And the manager of the Monarchs, player manager of the Monarchs, was Jose Mendez. He had been one of the best pitchers in Black baseball in the early 1900s. But by 1920, he had a sore arm and he played shortstop. But he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2006. The Indianapolis ABCs were also one of the teams in the first Negro for the Negro National League. Ben Taylor was the first baseman, and he's one of the best first basemen in professional baseball. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2006. The center fielder was 23-year-old Oscar Charleston, and he is considered, probably, many considered him the best all-around player in Negro League baseball history. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1976. And then there was Raleigh Biz Mackey, one of the best catchers in baseball history. He's noted for his defense, but in his youth, he was a good hitter. And he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1906. These were all players on the Indianapolis ABCs. The manager of the Detroit Stars, the player manager of the Detroit Stars, was Pete Hill. And in the early 1900s, he was considered one of the best center fielders in Negro League baseball. And he was so good that he's mentioned in the same sentence with Ty Cobb and Tri Speakers, who were in the major leagues in the early 1900s. Hill in 1920 could still hit. He could still hit 300, and he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1906. And then there was Andy Cooper. He was one of the best left-handed pitchers in Negro League baseball. He didn't have what you call a fastball, but he had a good curveball, and he got hitters out on his off-speed pitches. And he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1906. So the first season results, there was also one team that was what you would call an associate team in the Negro National League. And that was the Bacharach Giants out of New York. And what this did, this gave Negro National League teams access to the New York market, where they could go and play the Giants and also play semi-pro teams in the New York area. And the Giants could also come to the Midwest and play. Now, they could not compete. They were not able to compete for the Negro National League pennant. And also the games that were played against the Giants were not counted in the league standard. But they were, them being in the league were good financially for the teams in the Negro National League. The first game was May 20th, May 7th, 1920, and the Indianapolis ABCs beat the Chicago Giants 4-2. The Chicago American Giants were the first champions for the first Negro National League. The season was completed, and all teams were able to turn a profit. And there were 616,000 paid admissions for that first year. So that it was a success. However, there were some problems. The There were problems with competitive balance where the Chicago team, the Kansas City Monarchs, and the Indianapolis ABCs, they played over 40 games, whereas the Detroit, they won over 40 games, whereas the Dayton team won only 16, and the Chicago Giants won only 5. Then there was a problem with scheduling, where some teams had more access to parks than others, and because they had problems making out rainouts because they couldn't get a park if a game was scheduled and it was rained out, they could not immediately get the park again to take care of the rainout. Then there was a lack of publicity where no team standings were printed in the local black papers. Although the black press was involved in the formation of the Negro National League, there was never an understanding where the press and also the Negro National League needed each other. They didn't understand that papers, the baseball sold papers, and that papers helped promote baseball. Now that was something that major league teams and the major white newspapers understood. During the season, in terms of white papers, the sports section was increased because it sold papers, and it also helped promote baseball. But the black news media and the Negro National League just was not able to understand that. And then also there was a problem of players jumping to Eastern teams for more money. For the 1921 season, the Gates receipts declined by 25%. Now, there was bad weather in the spring that canceled games, and the Dayton Marcos, they were moved to Columbia, Ohio, in an effort to attract more fans. There was also an increase in travel costs that cut into the operating budget of the teams. But the Chicago American Giants, they won the second pennant for the second time in the second season. In the Columbus Buckeyes, which replaced the Dayton Marcos, they were managed by John Henry Pop Lloyd, who was the best shortstop in Negro League history, and he's in the Hall of Fame. He had played for the Chicago American Giants for Rube Foster, and so Foster hired him to manage this team in Columbus. And also the coach the coach was Saul White, and White was one of the last African Americans to play in organized baseball, white organized baseball in the late 1800s. He had also managed the Philadelphia Giants in the early 1900s, the team in which Rube Foster pitched for. So he was a coach for the Columbus Buckeyes in 1921, in 1921. And he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2006. There were two associate teams in the Negro National League in 1921. They both paid an associate fee of $1,000. They were the Bacharach Giants, who were back for their second year. But for the first time, it was the Hilldale team of Darby, Pennsylvania. Darby was a suburb of Philadelphia. And with this, the Negro National League had access to Philadelphia and also to the market in South Jersey. And also, of course, Hilldale had access to the Midwest. The owner of the Hilldale team was Ed Bolden, and he had past conflicts with Ruth Foster. Bolden had stolen 3 of Foster's players in 1919, but Foster ignored it because he wanted access to that Eastern market. And Bolden saw the success of the NNL in 1920. So they agreed to agree, and they put their hard feelings behind them. And so 1921 was considered a success, even though the profits were not as high as 1920. In 1922, there were new faces in the league, but also key losses. C.I. Taylor, who was the owner and manager of the Indianapolis ABCs, died suddenly. And he and Foster had been rivals, but also had a good working agreement prior to 1920. So after his death, his wife, Olivia Taylor, started running the team. And she is one of the first women owners in professional baseball. Now, there were 2 teams, the Cleveland Tate Stars and the Pittsburgh Keystones, that came into the league in 1922. But by the end of the year, both of them disbanded. And the Chicago American Giants, Ruth Foster's team, won the pennant for the 3rd straight year. Also in 1922, the St. Louis Giants sold their team to a group of Black businessmen in St. Louis, and they changed the name of the team to the St. Louis Stars, and they began to rebuild the team with young players. One of the young players that year was a 19-year-old kid from Mississippi who came to St. Louis, and his name was James Bell. He was a left-handed relief pitcher, and he went in relief situations as a pitcher, which a lot of times which were difficult situations when he would come in with the game on the line with men on base. But he also had a demeanor in which he never let the situation rattle him. He kept his composure. And after one game, somebody said he was a real cool papa, and that nickname stuck. And he became James Cool Papa Bell. And even though because of his speed, he played out in the outfield, and he did not pitch. But that nickname stuck, and he was because of his speed, he was one of the best base stealers and outfielders in baseball history, and of course he is in the Hall of Fame. But the big problem for Foster and the Negro National League in 1923 was the formation of the Eastern Colored League, which were teams along the Eastern Seaboard. They were the Baltimore Black Sox and the Brooklyn Royal Giants, the Bacharach Giants of Atlantic City, which prior was an associate member of the Negro National League, which was also the Hilldale Club in Darby, Pennsylvania, and the Lincoln Giants in New York, and the New York Cubans. They were all part of this new league, the Eastern Colored League, and it was formed by Ed Bolden of the Hilldale Club. He was critical of Foster's leadership. He wanted his associate member's fee of $1,000 returned to him. So he and Foster were in a dispute, and basically it was a petty clash of egos between Foster and Bolden. And Foster's concern, of course, was that the Eastern Colored League raided the Negro National League, that they were throwing reckless money at Negro National League players. In terms of the Negro National League in 23, there were the Milwaukee Bears, who disbanded at the end of the year, and then also the Toledo Tigers, which became the first Negro National League team that disbanded before the season ended. Now, the Kansas City Monarchs won the Negro National League pennant in 23, so they were the first team other than the Chicago American Giants to win the pennant. In 1923, the paid attendance for the league was about a little over 400,000. So the total revenue was a little over 200,000. So there were more people that attended New York Yankee home games than attended Negro National League games, because the Yankees drew over a million people that year. However, the league kept operating. The ship kept sailing. So in 1924, the war between the Eastern Colored League came full circle. Key Negro National League players went to the Eastern Colored League in 1923 and 1924. Foster tried to publicly downplay the war. He said there was still enough talent pool of Black players to draw from, and that he said the Eastern Colored League didn't know how to really develop players. That's why they were stealing players from the NNL. But Bolden believed that they had the upper hand, that the Eastern Colored League teams had the upper hand. There were bigger markets: Philadelphia, New York, Washington, D.C., and there was less travel between cities. So the cost of travel was less, and they could pay players more. They paid players $100 more per month than the Negro League players, and also in terms of star players, they could play their star players $200 to $275 per month, which was more than that they could be paid in the Negro National League. So in the press, the feud was all in the press, and it was really bad publicity for the Negro National League. So there was a need for peace, and that peace came in 1924. The Black press always wanted the Negro National League to pattern Major League Baseball, even though that did not fit the business model for the Negro National League. So they led a campaign for fans for a World Series in 1924. And Foster saw this as an opportunity for peace with the Eastern Colored League, because neither one of them wanted to be a stumbling block and continue this bad publicity. So an agreement was made before the 1924 season. The agreement was that there would be no tampering between the two leagues in terms of players, and that's what Foster really wanted. So a committee was developed to settle disputes between the two leagues, and that they would stop the war in the newspapers. So the first Negro League World Series was played at the end of 1924, the 1924 season, and it would pick the Kansas City Monarchs against the Derby Club, the Hilldale Club of Derby, Pennsylvania. The Monarchs, of course, would have Bullet Rogan and Jose Mendez. And then also they had Newt Allen, who was considered the best second baseman in the Negro Leagues at that time. And Hilldale had Louis Santop, who was, although he was near the end of his career, he was considered the best power hitting catcher in Negro League baseball at that time. And he's in the Hall of Fame. He was inducted into Baseball Hall of Fame in 2006. They also had Julius Judy Johnson. He played shortstop, played third base, and he's also in the Baseball Hall of Fame. And then there was Biz Mackey, who came over from the Indianapolis ABCs a couple of years prior. He's a Hall of Fame catcher, but when he played with Hilldale, he played third base because Santop was also still catching. And this is a picture of before the first game of the 1924 World Series. And I know the picture is small, but this was J.R. Wilkinson right there. This is Rube Foster, and this was Ed Bolden. So they came together and for the 1924 World Series. And it was a best of five. And Major League Baseball had just changed over from the best 4 of 7 at the beginning of the 1920 season. But prior to that, their World Series was also the best of 5 of 9. And the Monarchs won the series 5-4. Jose Mendez, who was the manager, he pitched the deciding game. In terms of projections for the 1924 Negro League World Series, overall, it was a success. 4 of the games were decided by 1 run. So the overall performance of the teams was a success. However, the financial projections were not. There were only 45,000 people who paid attendance in terms of the series. In terms of finances, the winning share for the Monarchs was a little over $300, and the winning share for each Hilldale team was a little less than $200. Now compare that to the Major League Baseball. The Washington Senators won the World Series for Major League Baseball that year, and each of their players received $5,000. And the Giants, which were the losing team, the New York Giants, the loser's share was $3,000 per player. So even though it did not meet the financial projections, the fact that it existed, there was a series, was a success. Now, the owners were lukewarm because they saw that it was not going to help them in terms of short-term profits. But Foster, he got what he wanted, and that was for the Eastern Colored League to honor the contracts as they went forward and stop the bidding war. So the 1925 season, there was peace, and in the Negro National League, there was a league championship series that began where, and this was to get more interest and also to promote the league. Basically, it was a split season where there was 50 games the first part of the season, 50 games the next, and the 2 teams would play each other at the end for the right to go to the World Series, But the biggest thing in terms of 1925 was that Foster himself was severely gassed in a hotel room in Indianapolis from a gas leak in a water heater pipe, and that began him to have health issues that would be carried over until the next season. Also in 1925, in terms of new faces in the Negro National League, one was Norman Turkey Stearns. He played outfield for the Detroit Stars. He was a power hitter, and he would lead the Negro National League in terms of home runs. And they said he had a strut like a turkey when he ran. And that was where he got his name, Turkey. And then also there was Willie Wales, who was shortstop for the St. Louis Stars. And he was considered, next to Pop Lloyd, the best shortstop in Negro League history. And he's also in the Negro League, in the Major League Hall of Fame. The Stars won the first half of the season, and the second half of the season, and the Kansas City Monarchs won the first half, and the Monarchs won the playoff of to go to the World Series. So the World Series in 1925 was a rematch between the Monarchs and Hilldale, but Bullet Rogan was injured. He had surgery to remove a needle that had broken off in his knee. So without Rogan, their best pitcher and their best hitter, the Monarchs were shorthanded, and the Hilldale got their revenge. They won the 1925 World Series, but it was not a financial success. Attendance dropped by 51%. And what happened was this: in the fall, there began a slight national recession that would go over into 1926. So it was definitely not a financial success. The big news for the 1926 season was the illness of Rube Foster. He was still showing effects of the gas poisoning that happened the previous year. And he was the stress and strain that was beginning to show. He had been the co-owner and manager of Chicago's team, the Chicago American Giants, for 16 years. Then also, 5 years he had been head of the Negro National League. Now, he ran the league in terms of his leadership style with a heavy hand. So he really did not delegate a lot of the authority to other people, which he could have, but he didn't. And then there was the pressure. Some opinion that he ran the Negro National League like a czar or a dictator. That was just some people's opinion. And then there was the pressure of being the face of Black baseball. He was trying to reshape the American Giants, his team, because they had not won a pennant in 2 years. But what happened in 1926, he started to exhibit erratic and psychotic behavior. He had a nervous breakdown, and in September, he was committed to a mental institution where he stayed until his death. In the Negro National League in 1926, it was just the consistent, continued success of basically 4 teams: the Chicago American Giants, the Kansas City Monarchs, the Detroit Stars, and also the St. Louis Stars. There was the competitive balance. There was no competitive balance. The Dayton Marcos, who came into the league, they only won 6 games. And the Cleveland Elites, who came into the league, they only won 8. But the Chicago American Giants, they upset the Kansas City Monarchs and to win the league championship series. And the reason for that was Willie Foster, who was the half brother of Rube, who the younger half brother of Rube. He was a pitcher, and he defeated Bullet Rogan in a double hitter the last 2 games of the championship series. He was a left-hander, and he's considered the best left-handed pitcher in Negro League, in the Negro Leagues, Negro League baseball. And he's inducted to the Hall of Fame in 1926. Now, the World Series in Negro League World Series in 1926 was the Chicago American Giants and the Bacharach Giants. And the main thing about this series was this guy right here, Clyde Red Greer. He pitched a no-hitter for the Giants against the Monarchs. He was a journeyman pitcher, but this was his shining moment, one shining moment in his career. He pitched this no-hitter. Now, what's interesting is prior to this year, in Major League Baseball, Don Lawson was the first pitcher to pitch a no-hitter in the World Series. 1956, he pitched a perfect game against the Giants. He was also a journeyman pitcher, and that was his one shining moment. However, now that the Negro Leagues were considered professional leagues, and those statistics are going to be added to Major League Baseball statistics. Now, Clyde Red Greer will be the first pitcher to pitch a no-hitter in a World Series. That his name will go in the record books. Now, the Giants won this series behind the pitching of Willie Foster. He won 2 games in the series. In 1927, this would be the first year that the league would be run without Rube Foster. There were 2 teams that were added back into the league: the Memphis Red Sox and the Birmingham Black Barons. Now, with the Barons coming into the league, they had a young 20-year-old pitcher by the name of Leroy Page. They called him Satchel, and this would be his first time in professional baseball when he came with the Birmingham Black Barons. Of course, Page would go on to be one of the best pitchers in baseball, in Major League in baseball. And he's inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1971. He is the first Negro League player inducted into the Hall of Fame. And that was in 1971. And then also in 1927 was the debut of George Mule Suttles. He was a power hitter. He would go on to be one of the best power hitters in Negro League baseball in the 1930s and then off in the 1930s. He was with the St. Louis Stars in 1927, and he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2006. The Negro League World Series in 1927, what was a rematch between the Chicago American Giants and also the Bacharach Giants. The Chicago won. Willie Foster, of course, was the star pitcher again. But the series was a failure, and it would be the last Negro League World Series played until 1942. In 1928, the Eastern Colored League disbanded, and in the Negro National League, there was the battle between the established teams, and the Chicago, the pennant was fought between the Chicago American Giants and the St. Louis Giants, the St. Louis Stars, and the Stars won. This was they won the pennant the first time they'd win a pennant, and Branch Rickey at that year was the general manager of the St. Louis Cardinals, and he saw the St. Louis Stars, and he saw basically that African-American players were ready for the major leagues. And he remembered that when he went and became the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers by 1947. And of course, Ricky was the one who brought Jackie Robinson in to erase the color line in 1957. But I have to believe that when he saw in the St. Louis Stars in the 1920s, he realized that African Americans could play in the major leagues. Real quickly, of course, the stock market crashed in 1929, but the recession or the depression, it really started in terms of African Americans prior to that year, because in 1927, in terms of the rise in unemployment and low wages. So the Negro National League had really started to see the effects of the economic downturn before the stock market crashed. But the Kansas City Monarchs won the pennant that year, 1929, and it was their third Negro National League pennant. Going to 1930, the big news, of course, was the death of Rube Foster. He died in 1930. Even though he was out of the league since 1926, his death in 1930 really sort of indicated that the end was near for the Negro National League. Even though they had a 9-team league, they were basically on life support. And then, of course, in 1930 was the beginning of the Great Depression. The St. Louis Stars won the Negro National League pennant that year. But the big news basically was night baseball and baseball. What happened was James Wilkerson, J.L. Wilkerson, the owner of the Kansas City Monarchs, in 1929, he had developed a portable lighting system. And he used the system a couple of times in 1930, which would be the last year that he would be in the Negro National League. Now, this is a picture of what he had made. These were 1,000-watt floodlights. There were 6 floodlights per pole. 6 poles were anchored on a truck. They were 50 feet above ground, and they had a generator at 15 gallons, used up 15 gallons of gas per hour. So this was the system that he had developed. Now, it was not perfect, okay? They was not like the lights that were in ballparks today. The generator, they had wires in center field because of the generator, so the outfielders had to beware. And there were problems with fly balls and pop-ups where the fielder had to wait until the ball came from out of the dark into under the lights to catch it. The batters had problems in terms of seeing the pitch that was thrown to him, and then of course the infielders had problems. They had to make sure that they saw line drives that were hit to them quickly to catch them. But it did increase game attendance. The whole purpose was to allow people who worked during the day to come to baseball games at night, and that fit into the business model of Negro League teams: more games, more revenue. And Wilkerson rented out the system to other teams to use. And he was far ahead of Major League Baseball, because the first Major League Baseball night game would not be until 1936. 1931, there were only 6 teams in the Negro National League. There were no American Giants, no Kansas City Monarchs. The only original teams were the Detroit Stars and the Indianapolis ABCs, and they were owned by different owners. So by mid-season, the Negro National League came to an end. So the league had the same problems that were paramount for the Negro League, the Negro baseball or Black baseball business model. The teams were undercapitalized. They had cash flow problems. They didn't have another source of revenue or to invest into the team. There were no teams that had ownership of stadiums, so they had to pay from 30 to 20 or 40% for stadium rental, and that cut into their operating budget. And it also caused scheduling problems. For the Negro National League, there were years in which every year different teams played a different amount of games because of the stadium problems. So it was hard to come up with league standings to be printed in the newspapers because the teams played an unequal number of games because of the stadium issue. It wasn't like Major League Baseball where all the teams played 154 games. Then of course, the target market, the Black fans, they reacted or were privy to the ins and outs of the volatile economic situation. So a lot of times they did not have money consistently to pay for tickets for the games. And the main revenue was game receipts. The more games they played, the more money that they made. And that was a problem for the Negro National League because teams would not play league games and would replace and they would go play exhibition games where it would be more money. And it was just the independent survivor attitude of the Negro League owners. Major League owners realized that even though they were competitive on the field, they had to have cooperative attitude for league matters that benefited all the teams. And Negro League owners never got to the point where they understood that. Their main goal was short-term profits for the individual teams at the expense of whatever long-term benefit the league could provide. However, the Negro National League was still the first successful Black professional league. And despite the economic problems and financial situations, it operated from 1920 to 1931. So it was successful. 18 members of the Baseball Hall of Fame either played or managed in the Negro National League. And it was the foundation for professional baseball. The Negro National League that was formed in 1933, that ran into 1944, used the blueprint of the former Negro National League and also the Negro American League that was formed in 1937 and ran into 1962, which was the end of the Negro League baseball era. They used the blueprint that Foster developed for the formation of that league. And Sarah, are there any questions?
That was fascinating and so much information. No questions yet, but just for those of you in attendance, if you have any, please do put those in the chat box. So I guess Kevin, I never realized that there were several various leagues, and this is probably just, you know, on me, but you know, people say the Negro National League, and I guess I considered that was a catch-all for all of the Negro League baseball teams. Can you talk more about that, Miss
Yeah.
Communication?
Well,
I think that I'm probably not the only person that
no,
thinks that.
okay,
So,
okay. Well, up until 1920, there were attempts to form a Black professional league, but all the attempts failed because none of the attempts lasted for an entire season. Okay, so that's why what Rube Foster did was so significant, because despite the racial atmosphere and environment, he put together the Negro National League, and that was the first professional Black professional league that was formed, and it existed between 1920 and 1931. Now, that consisted mostly of teams in the Midwest, Chicago, Detroit, Indianapolis, St. Louis, and Kansas City. Okay, but there were also African American Black teams on the Eastern Seaboard. Okay, and they formed a league in 1923, and it's called the Eastern Colored League, and that was the second Black professional league that was formed. All right, and so they operated along with the Negro National League basically up until the stock market crash and the Depression. Okay, and so after that, Negro League teams went back to the way they operated prior to 1920, which they were independent, right? And basically there was no league format, and they basically played games wherever they could play. They played against white semi-professional teams. They had the touring circuit where they went to different cities and played each other. And like I said, Wichita was definitely on that circuit. Okay, but they were basically independent. There was no league structure. However, in 1933, a gentleman by the name of Gus Greenlee, he formed what would be the Negro National League. All right, and that league basically consisted of teams from the East, like Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York, and that was in 1933. And then in 1937, the Negro American League was formed, and it basically consisted of teams that were formerly in that first Negro National League in the Midwestern teams: Chicago, Kansas City, St. Louis, and Detroit. So those were the teams or the leagues from Negro League baseball. And then the Negro National League, the second Negro National League, went from 1933 to 1948, and it disbanded. And what happened, the significant thing during that time, was that baseball was integrated. That was after Jackie Robinson crossed the color line, and then African American and also dark-skinned Latino players played in Major League Baseball. And so what happened then is it drained the African American professional league, because now players could play in Major League Baseball. And then what it also did, it shifted the African American fans, okay, from the Negro leagues to Major League Baseball, because they saw it as social progress, right? Because now African Americans could play in the major league, so they kept up with Major League Baseball, trying to look about how their favorite players did, like Jackie Robinson and Roy Campanella, all right? And so even though after integration, the Negro Leagues were drained of their top talent, the Negro American League continued to operate and from the 1950s until early 1962, even though it was not considered a professional team, a professional league. Okay, it continued to operate, and that's why, in terms of the Negro League baseball era, it's considered between 1920 and 1948. And before and after, because after 1948, after integration, it was basically a minor league. Hopefully that helped you.
Quick follow-up. Did the Monarchs, just for my own, and because we've actually got some questions coming in from the audience.
Okay.
Did the Monarchs then play in the later leagues, or were they strictly with the Negro National League?
No, the Monarchs went with the Negro American League.
Okay.
After that, the Negro National League in the 1920s, after it disbanded, okay, then they went on the road. You know, the portable lighting system, they went on the road, and that sustained them until in 1937, they joined the other Midwestern teams and formed the Negro American League. So that's how that went.
Okay, thank you so much for clearing that up.
Yeah.
I feel a little bit silly that didn't make the connection before, but it makes total sense. Okay, can you talk a little bit about what the impact that World War II had on these leagues?
Okay, that's interesting, because whereas in the Major League Baseball, World War II drained a lot of the star players like Joe DiMaggio, Ted Williams, okay? But what happened was, when World War II came about, the economy in the United States changed. And because of the war economy, there were more job opportunities in terms of the war industry for African-American people. And there was another migration from the South to the Midwest and Northeast of African-Americans. And in the Northeast and Midwest, that's where the Negro League team franchises were operated. Okay, and I said in the presentation that after the 1928 Negro League World Series, that they did not have another Negro League World Series until 1942. And the reason for that was that the war years were a boom time for Negro League baseball, because the fans, the African Americans, even though there was still racial discrimination, they still had jobs where they were in a better economic situation, and they were able to have that extra money to go to Negro League games. And the other thing is that most of the Negro League players, they were a little older, and so they were not drafted. So like Josh Gibson and Buck Leonard, they did not go to the service, all right? And so they were able to play. So that was the reason why that the war did not really have a big effect in terms of players on the Negro League baseball as it did with the major leagues. Now, there were some Negro League players that were in the service, Monty Irvin and Buck O'Neill and Larry Doby, but overall, Negro League baseball, in terms of the war years, that was a boom year for them.
Yeah, that's fascinating. During the 20s, 30s, and 40s, there was a lot of violence toward African Americans. When traveling, how did players find places to stay and eat? Did they ever experience the violence?
Okay, during the 20s, the mode of transportation was train, okay? But it was during the Depression, that changed to buses. Okay, and most of the Negro League teams that survived during the Depression, they used buses. Okay, and they knew that they could not stay in regular hotels. So basically, a lot of them, they lived on the bus. You know, they knew where African-American hotels were, so they knew they could stay there. And what was also interesting is that during the Depression, there was the Dust Bowl, and a lot of migrants traveled from farm to farm, where Negro League teams actually met up, ran across some of them, and they stayed in some of the migrant camps with some of the people who traveled during the Dust Bowl. And even though there was they did not run into a lot of violence because they knew where to go and where not to go. Okay, that mode of travel was still sometimes treacherous, because we're talking about a time when there were not super highways, and that there was some bus accidents where some players were injured. Okay, but no, so that's how they basically got around the violence that was out there. They knew where to go and where not to go, and so that's how they did it.
And did any of the players play in the Mexican or Cuban leagues during their off season?
Oh yes, oh yeah.
How'd they do?
They did well. One player, Willard Brown, he played in the Mexican League and the Cuban League, and he's in the Hall of Fame, not only in the Baseball Hall of Fame, but also in the Cuban Hall of Fame. So yeah, they did it because in order to make money, they had to play year round. So after the Negro League season ended, they played in Mexico, and they played in Cuba. And the other reason why they liked playing in Mexico is because they did not run into the racial discrimination like they did in America. And a lot of them, when they went to Mexico, they did not play in the Negro League season. They stayed down there because the Mexican season was going on the same time as the Negro League season. And so the Mexican League was a headache for Negro League owners because they couldn't get their players to come back, to play on the Negro League teams. So yes.
That takes me to the end of the questions I have so far. I would draw everyone's attention to the evaluation I put in the chat box. That will take you to the evaluation for tonight's program so that you can fill it out and let us know what you thought, and share any of your suggestions or feedback. We do read those. So I'll put it in one more time, and then keep sending us your questions. We've still got a few more minutes left of the program. Okay, after the league ended, what typically happened with the players? What was retirement like?
Okay, after the Negro National League ended in 1931, okay, then the players, they scattered and they went wherever they could play. Some of them were picked up by other Negro League teams. Even though there was not a league, they still had played. They still what we call barnstorm. Excuse me. And let me give you an idea what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about barnstorming, when the leagues ended, the teams took the road. Say, for instance, the Monarchs, and they traveled from Canada to the Mexican border, and they play in semi-pro teams. And what was interesting, even though Major League Baseball was segregated in terms of semi-professional league and games and leagues, that was integrated. That was integrated because white-black competition drew crowds in the small towns where a town would know that the Kansas City Monarchs are coming to town. The town people will want to come out and see how their local team fared against a professional team like the Monarchs. And so that's how the Negro League teams survived during the 1930s. And like I said, there were touring circuits. So say the Monarchs and the Indianapolis ABCs would meet up in Wichita, and that would attract people to come out and see them play. And then the other thing is that you have to realize that the 20s and 30s, okay, Major League Baseball did not go further west than St. Louis. All major league teams were on the eastern seaboard and on the in the east. So cities in the west, they would love to go out and see what they would consider professional teams, Negro League teams, come out, and they would love to see them. So that's how they would that's how Negro League teams got their money after the Negro National League shut down in 1931.
Gotcha. And the words like barnstorming came up in our last program that we had with Phil Dixon,
right?
Because he talks a lot about that.
Right.
Now, do you know if the aviation industry had an impact on these leagues?
The aviation?
Mm-hmm. Aviation's pretty big here in Wichita. And so did, I'm assuming, I'm not sure if the person asking the question means like the employment, did they go and work on airplanes, or did teams start traveling through the air? I don't know.
Okay.
It's probably a little bit predating the air travel, but
yeah, it does predate air travel. But one interesting thing is that Negro League teams also did play what I would consider industrial league teams. During the 20s, industrial companies, okay, say like an aviation company or another company, they had leagues, they had teams, and this was a way in which was a employee satisfaction method. And there were industrial league teams that the Negro League teams did play. So there could be, and I don't know if there was or not, there could be in the aviation industry an industrial league team that the employees of that team formed a baseball team, and they played other industrial company teams, and they also played Negro League teams. These were all exhibition games. So in that regard, that could possibly exist.
Very cool.